Topic 1. Militias are on the rise in the US. We see them over the past year at protests both for and against BLM. Are there any benefits to having a well-regulated militia? Is that even a thing? Do we want armed groups that offer a challenge to the state's monopoly of violence? Or will these inevitably be essentially legal armed gangs that pose a threat to our society? Again, credit to our buddy Counterpoints. Thank you, Sephorus. But thank you for being so kind as to sub to the channel. That's really kind. You just like came out of nowhere. But thank you for the sub. Helps us out a ton. Anyone else? Sub, maybe? Give bits, give subs. That helps out a lot too. But anyway, thank you so much. We're going to do opening statements, starting with Matt Latin.
So I have a lot of content and a lot of thoughts on this specific topic. I'm going to try to keep it short just because I want to see what direction this ends up going in. A well-regulated militia is a part of our Constitution. It's literally, and that term is literally used in the Second Amendment. So there's I think there'd be a lot of troubles in trying to remove the concept of a militia. What they actually do and how effective they are is wildly questionable, though. And we'll get into that after I hear everybody's takes, because we can go in 10 different directions on this. And I'm just curious where everybody's at.
Okay, thank you. Nefarious.
Yeah, so generally the benefits that we get from militias are usually outweighed by the negatives. You can't really challenge a government like the US, especially on its on the military, because it puts a lot of money into that and the technology is actually insane. And would they be acting as armed gangs? I would probably say yes, and I'd say that's what they act as now. I don't think that's inherently bad. But yeah, I'd definitely say so.
Okay. Got a shout out to Sophia for being so kind as to get 552 on, because I didn't think anyone actually would. That was kind of wishful thinking, but she did. Help us out a ton. Start us off on the hype train, level 2 hype train. Help us get to level 3 hype train if you would, if you'd be so kind. Sub to the channel if you think we give you great content. We haven't really given you any content so far, that's true. But we if you potentially think we might give you great content, sub to the channel, give bits, give subs, helps out a ton. Thank you so much. All right, let's go to Counterpoints.
Yeah, so I don't think the militia concept is outdated. I think it's a check on power. I think it's a decent way to basically check the power of the central government is to have a free and armed population. I don't want the perception of freedom. I want actual freedom, which I think is basically necessary to be able to abolish your state by force, particularly if it becomes tyrannical. So I think these things are incredibly important. I do think that we need to do a better job of basically articulating this culture to people who are confused by it, because I think it's a fairly rare thing in history for a people to basically claim this right. So I do hope to kind of explain what I think the benefits of it are, and also to kind of expand people's interest in the concept. So I'll leave it there for now, but I'm excited for the open.
Thank you, and thank you taking else for gifting 3 hot 2 on gift subs. This is a surprise hype train, so hooray! Anyway, we're at 50% done, 50% left. Can we get to a level 3 hype train? Actually, might be a possibility. I don't know. Kind of people like you are helping us out. Remember, sub, gift bits, or gift subs, or resub. That helps out too. And thank you, Eucharist, for resubbing and being the first one to start this whole thing. Anyways, let's see if we can make it. We have 2.5 minutes left. Let's go to Spectre.
Yeah, so look, I used to think that militias and guns at protests were probably a good idea, that they would reduce the amount of violence due to the fact that, somebody sees you have a gun, they're less likely to punch you in the face, hopefully. But all the data that I've looked at pretty much prepping for this panel, surprisingly enough, seems to indicate that it's actually 6 times more likely for a protest to erupt into violence if protesters on either side are armed. That and 84% of armed protests in the U.S. Have been in reaction to BLM protests that were peaceful. So it doesn't really work out well from my side. I would say that a well-regulated militia probably wouldn't be an issue, but I don't think that these militias are being regulated, and they're definitely not being regulated well. So if we could fix that, maybe we can have a conversation. But as things are right now, I think that we have to do something.
Thank you for that, and thank you, Counterpoints. What? Thank you for being so kind. I have to give 5 hot tier 1 gifts to the channel, helping us out a ton, like a huge.
I had a good day today.
Oh, that's great. I mean, thank you. Seriously, that means a ton, guys.
I don't think that's ever been the problem here. and by that mean, I just get my ass kicked.
Oh boy. But thank you for the kindness, and thank you, Wicked Domingo, for gifting 100 bits. Yeah, because of his kindness, we're at level 3 hype train, 11% done, 89% left. Can we get to a level 4 hype train? Help us out. Thank you so much. I didn't think we'd get this far. Sub, gift bits, gift subs, resub, or continuous sub. All of that is a huge help. We have 4 minutes left on the clock. See if we can do it. Rob Noerr, right? Rob Noerr. Okay, like what's gonna happen? He's gonna use a sexy voice, right? And like you're gonna realize this is top tier content. Like I gotta invest in this channel. If they're bringing people on like Rob Noerr, okay, well then there's no choice about it. Go ahead, Rob. Make us some money.
You want me to use a sexy voice? Is that what you're suggesting?
Oh yeah.
Don't worry, I'll get squeaky here in a minute as I get into it. So, yeah, I agree with Connor. There's a reason to have a militia as a check on government power, and we absolutely can see. You can see in places like Australia what happens if you don't have the right to protect yourself. So, I'm sure we'll get into that. As far as like militias that are more loosey-goosey, here's the thing. You have a Second Amendment right to arm yourself in self-defense. You have a right to free association. So if people collectively come together, as we're seeing, and want to give themselves a moniker or whatever, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that, regardless of what their political affiliation is. The last 2 things I'll say that have been mentioned, because I'll try to keep it short, is if you are a person that thinks that the police are corrupt or are systemically racist, then you should be in favor of the average person being able to arm themselves, because you don't want to give the monopoly on defense purely to the state. And the second thing I'll say is one of the reasons we're seeing an increased drive in this sort of militias that probably a lot of people on this panel don't like is because there has been a movement to encourage or downplay violence occurring over and over from the left, and telling the police that they should not step in to do them. I predicted early and often that if you did this, you would see things like people take matters into their own hands, like Kyle Rittenhouse. And that is absolutely what we'll continue to see, because if you engage in violence or defend this violence and force the police to stand down because you want to defund the police or think that they're bad, yes, eventually people will defend their own property. So we get into it though. That's fine.
Thank you. Yes, again, how about that hype train? Gift bits, gift subs, or sub yourself if you like the content we're going. Oh, also because someone asked me to. Hi, Boji. Thank you. Thanks for being around. I hope you're watching and feeling good today. All right, let's go to Mr. Fanatic.
I think when it comes to the militias, I think the whole point about them being like well regulated, I think is the most important factor. I think they're absolutely necessary. We've obviously seen in various places what a usurpacious government can do, what unchecked power is actually like. So I think that's somewhat of a problem. I think especially when you start like considering like when things, the more uncertain times get, then I think then probably the more justifiable I would find them. I think the fact that we've put them in the Constitution is not the idea that they'll always be needed. I think it's more so about the concept of making sure that making sure that they're available at times when we do need them. And I think sometimes we'll see that obviously we get different results whenever Black people decide to have militia versus when white people. Open carry for Black people is different than it is for white people, as everything in this country seems to interact differently with African Americans. But I guess there's more to get into in the open.
Thank you. Less than a minute left. See if we get that hype train level 4. But thank you so much, people who have that so far. Problematic Pan.
Yeah. So I think that right now, obviously, militias aren't, doing the providing the benefit that we want them to. But that's because they're like an insurance policy. Therefore, when or if a government becomes tyrannical, we shouldn't. While it might not be beneficial to have them in like a time of peace and relatively okay government, like right now, the cost of not having them when the government gets tyrannical is so huge, we can't afford to, be caught off guard. So I do think that even if, there is a slight disadvantage right now for militias existing, we need militias. And, I'm willing to pay that small cost now in exchange for when if the government does become tyrannical, we have organizations there that will, be able to help prevent the tyranny.
Thank you. Finally, Doobie.
So I guess if we went like full caveman brain, we could think of some benefits that might come from having PTSD rot veterans, meth addicted conspiracy nuts, and LARPers who couldn't cut it in the actual military, running around in the forest in body armor, pretending they'd do anything but be labeled domestic terrorists and droned if they actually rose up against a fully based, tyrannical U.S. government. But it seems like the real negatives massively outweigh the potential positives. So I think it's silly.
Wow.
Dude.
My man knows how to do a fucking mic drop, honestly. Like, all right.
So-
Open panel. Yeah.
Okay, so
Just real.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to Doobie real quick. I would rather take those former people that fought for our country that are addicted to meth than the pedophile terrorists that we see the left defending all the time. So if I had to put my money, I'd take the meth.
And the veterans are the
Rob-
same people in that analogy, though.
What?
No, not and what's
Oh,
worse
oh.
than that is it depends on what their roles are. Like if we're not talking about like who we want to be rioting or who we want to be doing some sort of protest. We're talking about who's going to be the people who are going to have like a very unique, power that allows them to sort of cause justice to occur. And I think like the idea that we would want any people on drugs or with PTSD that are like literally the authorities who are supposed to be the ones holding society together at the same, those things are not the same at all. And I don't think anybody, including Rob Noerr, who made that statement, would actually want that, right?
I think that he was being tongue-in-cheek and making a joke about a lot of people that have PTSD or have drug
No, I
problems.
wasn't. I was
might
being
consider
totally
them-
serious.
Okay, well, they consider themselves in those groups, but it's funny coming from you fuckheads that will defend
that's totally
pedophiles like
Hold
Rosenbaum
on.
that are out there
Be
marching
clear.
saying, shoot me N-word in
Jesus
the name of Black
Christ.
Lives Matter. But it's
No,
cool. You
hold
gotta-
on. To be clear,
John King
I
gave him a
think
race
all those
pass.
Antifa nutbags should have been rounded up and put in a cage somewhere. Like I'm not
Cool.
I'm not defending lefty rioters. Like what are you
Cool.
talking about?
God,
Cool.
Doobie.
We've missed you, Rob, right? It hasn't been the same
so-
about you.
So I'm gonna actually focus on the militia part and less about like the recent events will be applicable soon. But like, okay, so militias are not just an insurance policy. Like the idea that a militia, like a well-armed group, operating within a country, is almost like it's not just insurance when there's a tyrannical government. It's also like something that a government would consider before passing bad policy. And this isn't just in the United States, this is everywhere. Like if you look at it historically, like just like looking at like France, like for like the 80-year period after the French Revolution on, like their National Guard basically acted as like this independent body that sort of tried to keep their authoritarian leaders in check on some level, and with varying degrees of success. So I think militias are important, and I think we do actually have well-regulated militias, like in the form of our National Guards, right? Like each state has its own National Guard units, and those are its own independent, well-regulated groups that you could kind of equivocate to being a militia. So I think we already have things like that. If we're looking at the folks who are quote unquote LARPing in the forest and body armor and stuff, those are a different group altogether. And I think those groups might be a little bit more concerning, not just like on the right, but like anyone, right? Because if you have a situation where we can't even agree on what authoritarian is, right? So like the left thinks, or let's look at what the right thinks actually. So the right thinks that vax programs are tyrannical, and then the left thinks that sending ICE to round up protesters without any identification is tyrannical. And we've got like a lot of different things that different groups think are tyrannical, and we can't agree on these things. So if you have a bunch of armed people who have different ideas of what tyranny are, and they have guns instead of words that clash about these ideas, then we're going to have civil strife. So like I think
Real quickly, but that's not
Yeah.
the like National Guard wouldn't be a militia, right? Because the militia needs to be like something of just citizens, like untrained and unprofessional, like that, like that's pretty much what a militia is. Like if we start like taking actual government entities, now I understand this is state government and not federal, but if we start taking government entities and trying to label them as a militia, I think that starts getting a little bit absurd. And the idea that like any of these things would actually be any sort of check against the government is, I think, absurd. And I get the militias aren't they're not exclusively like insurance policies, but I think there's enough evidence to pretty much suggest that was like the spirit behind why they were talking about well-armed militias.
Let's
Right?
go.
Yeah, they were
you should
talking about a
Google
civilian
militia.
force that should be able to be raised, like to support basically the actual military in the state of emergency. It's usually what a militia will mean.
that's
Either
not
that
true.
or
That's-
like they'll respond to like terrorist acts.
No, that's not
Sure,
That's
but I was
definitely
going by
not
the
that's
definition.
that's
If you
not
go
the
to the
spirit.
If you go to the Wikipedia article on militia, and they talk about it, says the National Guard is a militia force organized by each of the 50 states.
Yep.
Right, but
Sure,
listen,
but
Well, it's
militia
yeah, it's a
doesn't
militia, but
refer
it's not what
just
we're
it's
talking
the
about.
federal government, but clearly they like will often be used to uphold certain things in edicts of the federal government, and I can't think of any times really where the National Guard has been used as some sort of force against
on
the
the
federal
federal
government,
government?
right?
Well, can you think of any times that the federal government acted in a tyrannical manner that required that sort of necessity from the states?
but listen. So here's the
Probably
first,
maybe-
militia doesn't.
I would
Militias
I would
can
imagine
exist
plenty of them
outside
feel
the
that
government, right? Because militias can exist outside the government because that's the entire idea of the Second Amendment and the spirit of why it was created. Because the founding fathers understood that governments can get tyrannical. So you don't want a militia in that term that they're saying you have the right to arm and protect yourself, only being agents of the government, because they were worried that that government could become corrupt. So clearly, militias, although they can't exist under state authority, could exist outside of that state authority as well. And the idea of, can you think of an example of when the government's become tyrannical that required an outside state militia? Well, it's not just that. Arguably, there are many times, like, for example, you could say that about slavery. If we had an outside state militia that would have been able to fight back against slavery, that would have probably been a good thing, right? Right. So that was a decision, right?
But
Yeah,
we
and
did
there
have
were.
that.
That's true. Right. So sure, it's happened. But the point's not just that. The point is to be a check, because if people have the right to be armed and to come together, which it doesn't matter what you think about whether you like those groups or not, they absolutely have the right to be armed, and they absolutely have the right to come together. Well regulated just means basically trained and well equipped enough to be a force. That's all well regulated.
Can I back up Rob here definitionally? Because basically, like, you can go to a website, it's called guncite.org, guncite.org, and they basically have like a whole bunch of historical documents that like corroborate this definition, where well regulated didn't mean regulated by the government, it meant well trained or well disciplined. So within the historical context of the time, it absolutely meant like free people. And as a matter of fact, like, you know, it's kind of silly because to even have this conversation, because the founding fathers, and pretty much for the entirety of the 19th century, most government officials didn't even think the United States should have a standing army. They wanted to disband it every single time there was a conflict. So like, so what really frustrates me whenever we have this conversation, not anybody in this room, but we have this conversation where they're like, oh, well, they wrote stuff with feathers, so we don't know what they meant. And it's like, no, it was 150 years ago. They wrote books and shit. We know what they were talking about, and we know what their politics were. So you have to accept the fact that from a historical standpoint, the founders of the country wanted the people to have firearms, to be self-reliant, and to check the power of the federal government. And you have to move on from that point and then ask the question, is that good or is it bad? And to what extent is it good or is it bad?
Rob, do you unironically think a couple of people with guns can take on the American military?
Yes.
It's not the point. It's not just that, right? Like, let me respond to that with a question. Do you think that the American military would nuke the United States?
Why the fuck would they
the United
nuke?
States?
Yeah.
Why would they
Right.
nuke us when they have
Would
drones
probably
that can
happen
snipe us
if-
out
I'll
of the
get to the
sky?
point.
The police
Right,
would
do you
just
think they
take
would
their
use
toys away,
Apaches?
and then they'd kill a police officer and be on the news as domestic terrorists, and then they'd get fucking rounded up by the army or something.
Yeah,
I-
right.
I don't.
Sorry, my
unless-
bad.
unless you're
Asking the
talking like a
lizard talking
mass
about meth.
uprising.
Right.
Doobie,
Yeah,
you're
I
the
don't
kind of
know
person
about
who would
that.
want to
So
check
if you allow me to
power
finish,
against not taking
the reality is when
Tell me
people,
how
the
that's
reality
realistic
is,
to play
the
out
reality is that when people talk about, well, these militias couldn't take on the U.S. military, they're doing a point-by-point comparison, saying the military has Abrams tanks, they have Apaches. That shit's not going to be used on American citizens. The point is
Waco?
this: the
Waco?
people's right to defend
Do they use
themselves
Apaches?
does imply that there would be a certain mechanism of defense that these militaries wouldn't be used as they would as a hostile power in another country. And so
Hold
the
on,
fact
but
that we
this
have the
would
right
be
to
a-
arm
this would be a
ourselves would be
domestic
enough of a
terrorist
deterrent to, but it works better if you let me finish before you talk. The fact that we have the right to arm ourselves works as a deterrent from preventing that conflict from even happening. Whereas if you are disarmed, then a tyrannical government doesn't even have to have a standing military in order to take your rights away.
Okay,
Yeah,
but
it
what we're
increases
talking
the
about,
costs, right?
wait,
If you
one
want,
second. What we're talking about isn't a tank being used against random ass citizens in the street. We're talking about a domestic terrorist group that is expressed and probably enacted, right? Its desire to fight the U.S. Government and it can kill government officials, whether they're like state officials or like police officers or whatever the fuck.
Okay,
Right?
but
So,
Doobie,
yeah,
can you
if you have these
just
people
back up?
under a tyrannical government, we want that, right?
In some makeshift fort somewhere, right? Saying that they're not going to turn over the weapons when the police show up, right? They are going to pull out the
Waco.
fucking tanks. Absolutely, they will if they have if they know these people have like machine guns or whatever.
Okay, Doobie, can you hold on, really quick? Can you just back up real quick and like, can we run through, because none of this stuff happens in a vacuum. I swear to God, I know exactly what Rob like is pointing at, which is basically like people think military versus militia. Let's line up all our pieces on a chessboard. There's 70 million people who haven't done cardio since 2004, and then there's like predator drones. Let's see who comes out on top. That's not how civil conflict works. That's not how politics works. That's not how insurgency works. Like seriously, like the thing about this entire concept is that like Doobie, number one, like I don't know how much of your personality is memes, but you're the exact kind of person that I don't want deciding who gets guns, right? Because if your perspective is that only the government gets guns, that's kind of part of the problem. Number two, what I would say is that basically like irregular warfare, like the fairies, you keep nodding your fucking head. Like we were like the world's big shaking. You keep shaking your head like the United States, the world's most dominant military power, wasn't beaten as a conventional force by the Vietnamese and the Afghan guerrillas within the past decade. So seriously, okay, and let me point out this other thing that's annoying. Why did the US lose
the Vietnam War?
Okay, so what's that?
Why did the U.S. lose the Vietnam War? Did they
because
get
it was
maybe because their forces exhausted the will of the political will of the United States of America.
Yeah, so they didn't get beat by guns, right?
They had guns.
They would have lost the Vietnamese.
You gotta break this down like fucking Barney style. Okay, seriously, I bring up this quote. I understand. I don't think we've met in the past. Okay, so there's this quote by Karl von Clausewitz, which is very important when it comes to conversations like this, which is basically that warfare is politics by other means. Which basically means that like you don't extrapolate into a neat binary warfare or politics. They're a continuum of each one. So when diplomacy is on the table, you use diplomacy. When mixed things are available, you use a combination of force and diplomacy. When war is the only option, then you use war as the option. So that's the thing. It's like stop thinking about like whether or not the NVA or the guerrillas won militarily. They didn't win militarily, but they exhausted a global empire with technology that was literally like a century greater than theirs, and as a result, that exhausted empire basically retreated. And not only that, but if you were talking about having a conflict within the United States, they would be destroying the very resources that they're reliant on in order to fund the military expense in the first place. A civil war is infinitely more destructive than a war that's conducted on foreign ground.
Yep. Do you feel like the U.S. would just
can I respond?
Yes, probably. If the
So why did the U.S. back off in Vietnam?
Can I come back?
Yeah,
he'd already answered that. He just said it.
I just answered it. I just said it like 10 seconds ago.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I can come back.
Wait.
Wait, 1 second. So I'd like to just respond. Because to be clear, I don't think that if something like this were to happen, it's going to be like a total war game, right? Where everybody's lined out in the field and they fight each other really neatly, right? We could look at something like Lorenzo brought up, or Nerferis, whatever the fuck your name is right now. The Waco siege, right? So you had one group of nuts somewhere in a compound, holed up together. The government wanted to come in. They said no. They fired at the government officials, so they burned the fucking place down, right? So and they'd be labeled as domestic terrorists, right? They'd be rounded up there, and if not there, then at their homes. And if you're affiliated with this group, hey, you're going on a fucking list. And if you're caught somewhere out in public, you can get rounded up just like everybody else, right? This isn't like I don't think it's reasonable to say that any of these groups, even if they had 1,000 members, right, could put up like an actual fight against the government the moment they made their intentions clear to resist the government with force.
Okay, Doobie, but if I can see, hold on, Rob, real quick. If I can concede this point that like basically a holdup group in a compound isn't going to be able to withstand the force of the United States, can you concede that politicians will take it into their political calculus, knowing that whatever legislation or executive action they take will be balanced by the ability of average citizens to resist their will with weapons?
No.
Like, can you?
Well, I think they take it. Wait, hold on. I think they take it into account, but not in the way that you're thinking. Because if I were a politician, right, and I was pushing a really important piece of legislation, and I knew that there was a chance that people on the other side of the aisle, their supporters might go out and kill people over it, or try to kill me over it, I'd fucking do it, because that's a massive political win for my side of the aisle. Why wouldn't I do that? Why wouldn't I want to go out and kill people? That would make a lot of sense to push my side of the aisle's agenda, right? Because now the other side is populated by nutbags.
Right, there are people like you.
They're not going to be just nutbags, though.
There are people like you that cheer for death and think, oh boy, we'll push people to the point where they feel the need to do something terrible so that we could use them. By the way, that's probably what happened January 6th. You saw these left-wingers that cheered for violence over and over again. I predicted if you allow one side to engage in violence, predictably the other side will, and then the left will say, oh my God, see, this is a political win for us. Look how bad this is. So I'm glad for that admission that you would do that. You're also wrong about it. Real quick. You're also wrong about exactly what happened in Waco. Actually, what happened was the government came in and started shooting first, including shooting through closed doors. They also used tear gas to the extent which they admitted they knew would cause torture to the children that were in there. Ended up killing.
We're talking about the technical stuff, not the
right. But so I just want to see you wrong. Lastly, what I want to say is I don't understand what your point is here, Doobie. Like, you're arguing there is no specific militia in the United States today that could overtake the U.S. government. That's true. Connor and I are talking about the needs to protect the rights for people to form militias and how that is a check on tyranny. But you're right. Could the Branch Davidians overthrow the government? No. Could the Oath Keepers overthrow the government? No. But that's not the purpose of the Second Amendment and what we're talking about when the Founding Fathers were talking about well-regulated militias.
Yeah, as the government gets more and more tyrannical, the people who are part of these militias are going to become more and more mainstream. So we're not going to have just these wackos. Like, if the government gets tyrannical enough, there's going to be, a bunch of people who are relatively normal who are going to be supporting it and actually fighting in it, right? So the idea that just because right now our militias are full of maybe nutbags doesn't mean that in the future, against a tyrannical threat, it would still only be the nutbags fighting. No, people like Counterpoints would join the militias and fuck some shit up. So if
that's
the
not
government
a
was
good
truly
thing.
tyrannical.
Well,
yeah, it is.
Fuck some shit
well,
up.
then don't
do
crazy shit with the government.
All right.
Then don't
talking
do crazy
about?
shit
What
with
do
the
you mean by
government.
crazy shit? What's crazy shit?
Let's clean this
What's
up.
crazy shit?
Anything tyrannical. Anything tyrannical.
No, not anything tyrannical. We deal with minor infringements on rights and civil liberties all the time, which is why we need to be specific with our language and we need to not be hyperbolic. Name a thing. I would say the Patriot Act and drone bombing U.S. citizens without giving them a court date would be something that's flirting with a little bit of tyranny.
Okay, give me. Okay, that is tyrannical. Give me something that would not be tyrannical that you would say would justify a militia.
I think militias should be justified as default. I'm sorry, I'm not understanding the question. Can you ask it again?
Or I'm basically. Can you think of anything that's tyrannical that you would say that doesn't justify a militia?
Can I think of things that are not okay? Let me give you an example of things that are not.
No. That's not what I asked.
Okay.
I asked.
Yeah. Okay.
Can you think of anything that's tyrannical that doesn't justify a militia?
No, I think that.
So you would agree that. So then you would agree that anything tyrannical would justify a militia, and reasons why we would the potential for anything tyrannical is why we have the militias allowed, right?
No, it makes no sense. Again, we're starting from a right to form a militia. The default is you have a right to have a militia. You saying, but aren't there tyrannies that could be solved without militias? Of course, that doesn't.
No, that's not what I'm
saying.
My question. I'm sorry if you didn't comprehend. That wasn't my question. That's not what I was asking. I'm sorry. So what I'm basically saying is that the reason why the Founding Fathers wanted to create the militia is because they had the fear of a tyrannical government and becoming incredibly usurpacious, and their need to be able to for the citizens to be able to arm themselves against it. That was the entire purpose of it. So when I'm asking you, is there anything tyrannical? Because you're saying no, it's not just it's not. That's not enough. I don't understand where the disagreement is. It sounds like all of us would agree that because of the potential of tyranny, that's why we would have a militia, right?
Doobie doesn't agree with that.
Yeah, I don't agree. So I agree that this right exists. I think that it shouldn't exist.
Okay. We're starting with different premises.
So wait. But saying the right to form a militia doesn't mean we want to repeal the Second Amendment. I still believe in American citizens' rights to bear arms.
I separate from a militia.
Because I wondered if this would come up. Let me interject to ask a question of Human Fairies. How can you say that we have the right to bear arms, but we don't have the right to associate together with that arm bearing?
Yeah,
isn't that all militia is in effect?
So when you form
it's just we're getting together in order to train. What's the problem? I'm asking you, buddy.
when you form, I'm trying to answer. When you form an organized group that's sole purpose is to attack the U.S. government, then you're a terrorist organization.
That's not the sole purpose of the militia.
Okay.
Sure.
So like
What's
a
the
lot of
militia
But
for
what's
then?
the other purpose of the
Handing
militia,
out
though?
candy in the neighborhood? Like,
Yeah. So actually, I wanted hold on real quickly. I wanted to answer this.
It's not a problem. That's fine. In those cases, sure, I'm positive. In all cases, if there is a tyrannical government, if there's a militia that's fighting against the government at that point, they would be labeled as terrorists from the government's perspective. That's fine. We don't have to debate that. We're saying that clearly the framers made it such that they wanted it to be that in those cases, like labels be damned, we can still do that, and that's exactly the purpose. We all, I don't. Does anyone here disagree that if they're do we disagree? Do you disagree if there's a case in which the government is being tyrannical and usurpacious? Do you believe that we should be able to have militias for such cases?
yes, but the only problem is, like, I don't think we could get there. Sorry, was that directed at Doobie?
It was directed at Doobie, but I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
it's literally to everyone. I think.
Well, I can answer the question. So, no, actually, I don't think it's a good idea.
Okay,
so
you're too far gone.
yeah, so I think that again we're dealing with like massively different definitions of what like tyrannical would be, right? Some people would say that the COVID vaccine mandates today is over the line. You know, the government's forcing you to put this vaccine in your body, and yada yada yada. Right? For some people, that's tyrannical. That's over the line. Right? For some people, requiring like fucking driver's licenses is tyrannical, right? So like I don't think that there's any point at which I'd agree with the correct response to quote unquote tyranny is, you know, forming a militia and murdering police officers and shit who are
What is something that you believe is tyrannical? I don't want to hear what some people think is tyrannical. I want to know what you think is tyrannical, and that you think we shouldn't have militias against that shit. Because yeah, there are some crazy people out there who think driver's license is tyranny. But that doesn't. Yeah, it's relevant.
Can you think of, Doobie, the same way I asked counterpoints earlier, can you think of anything that the government would do that you feel is tyrannical that a militia shouldn't respond to?
No, I can't
I
think
don't
of
know, like an ethnic
so unless
cleansing?
wait, hold on. So
Like,
wait, so Fanatic,
exactly.
one second. So unless we're getting to like fucking what Connor brought up, like ethnic, the government for some reason, all of your elected representatives decide that it's time to just murder all the white people, right? Then yeah, I think it'd be totally reasonable for them to defend themselves with weapons. Right? But I don't think we're like anywhere near like these fucking
That's not
fantasy
the
levels
point,
of
though.
violence.
Sure.
That's not the point of the principle.
We're not there right now, but the whole purpose was the question asked in general, which I'm glad you answered generally, even though you tried to get into specifics, is so you agree with me in those cases in which the government becomes tyrannical, then it makes sense to have that. And that sounds like you agree then with the founding fathers who that was their intention when they came up with that idea in the first place. It's the idea that we should be able to protect ourselves from a tyrannical government. Now, I understand the word tyrannical can be interpreted loosely by idiots and be used unscrupulously, and then people can start saying, oh, everything is tyrannical, and then justify all sorts of nonsense. I get that, but that's not, as long as you agree that in the cases in which it is something that is genuinely tyrannical, we should be able to have that. That's exactly all we're arguing
Okay,
about.
so hold on. So I said it'd be reasonable for them to like want to rise up with weapons and shit, but that's still, even in that scenario, I don't think it'd be a very, very good time for them, right? If it's just like the citizens doing that.
Nobody thinks it's going to be a good time. That's the whole point. It's supposed to be a
hold on,
fucking deterrent, so we never get there in the first place.
That kind of scenario, right, would probably lead to like an open like revolution, right? And that would be including like many components of the actual like military, right? So if we're getting to like those fantasy levels of like either ethnically cleansing the white people or something in this country, yeah, I guess in that scenario, yeah, we'd probably need a revolution. They'd probably need weapons. But I don't think we're anywhere.
What do you mean fantasy?
So if I can,
not in America, but it's
so,
happened in other countries.
So to jump in here, right? So first off, like, let me kind of reach towards kind of what Doobie's saying. I personally don't feel that there's any issue in the United States today that justifies political violence. Period. Not in the right, not in the left, right? That is not the express purpose of a militia, right? Like, first off, the way you're talking, Doobie, if we ever got to the point you're talking about, it would be impossible to that point to go, oh, okay, now it's got to the point of genocide. Let's raise a militia now. We've taken away the American people's right to have a militia for the past 100 years, to have arms, but now we'll do it now. It'll be too late at that point. The point is, the most effective use of a militia is as a deterrent. They don't have to pick up the guns because they have the right to pick up the guns. And the government knows that, and tyranny knows that. And not just the government and tyranny, but on a more personal level, the person who wants to cause you harm knows that. If you have the right to have a gun and have the right to protect yourself from aggressors towards you, then you're less likely to have to need to use it. So you seem to be thinking like the only purpose of a militia is for 10 people to get around drinking whiskey and go, we're going to overthrow the government. That's not what's happening. And to the effect that that is happening, yes, if people are using violence to actively overthrow the government, absolutely the government should treat them as a terrorist organization. That's different than just having the right to have a militia.
But the militias are not acting as a deterrent right now, because like 84% of the armed militias that we see actually acting are going to BLM protests. And what they actually do is they make it more violent. Roughly 1 out of 6 demonstrations where firearms were present included reports of violent or destructive behavior. And for demonstrations where no firearms were identified, that's only 1 out of 37, right?
But Spectre, that's correlative.
I want to hear from Lorenzo Counterpoints, and then who else wants hands raised? No one? Okay, Mad Latin Fanatic.
So the U.S. has a plethora of checks and balances to prevent this exact thing from happening, okay? What you're proposing is using militias as another form of checks and balances. I personally, and looking at it from an empirical perspective too, this specific form of check and balance damages the U.S. and especially the U.S. population more than it helps, as Spectre pointed out. Also, another thing is that if you're at a point where you're like taking up arms against the government, like why does it matter whether militias are outlawed or not? Like you're at a point where it's already like what you're doing is illegal. So how would that stop?
Okay. Why does it matter? Okay, can I address this in my whatever? Because basically, I feel like I can answer these questions well, okay? So, Spectre, number one, basically saying like firearms were present at a protest, and then also violence was present at a protest, therefore firearms are the thing that escalated the protest. This is like failure in... Hold on. Dude, I've been waiting for a few minutes, just let me go. Okay. This could be easily a correlative statement where basically like if there's already violence or arson or something like that, or if there has been violence for prolonged periods, then people are more likely to show up with guns because they've already basically said like, oh, this isn't a peaceful protest, I want to go protect my property, therefore I'm gonna show up with guns. And as a result, that escalates tension back and forth. Just saying that guns are present and violence is present is not sufficient to say that these things are like causative, all right? Then earlier, Nefarious was asking me like, are there non-revolutionary uses of militias? At least that's a question that I'm going to answer even if he didn't ask it. Yeah, absolutely. So, emergency disasters would be like a prime example of that. When you get together with your, with your friends, with your peers, with your community, you practice firearms management, you practice self-defense, you practice communication, you practice vehicle operations, then basically what you already have is you have a network that's capable of intervening in dangerous situations in order to help out other people. So, for instance, what would be Katrina, where the federal government and the local government broke down for 2 to 3 weeks, is a prime example in which a community militia would be a good thing to have. And then finally, why does it matter? The reason why it matters is because practice is incredibly important. Part of the reason why Doobie is able to meme on the fucking militias about being a whole bunch of like broken veterans who take like 800 milligrams of fucking aspirin every day and they haven't fucking like done cardio since like fucking 2006. I'm among these people, although I don't take aspirin. Like the reason why he's able to meme on that shit so hard is because it's true. But there are things that you need to practice, like basic firearm safety, like basic communication skills, like basic radio etiquette, like basic vehicle operations. These are all things that basically I don't just want to know for me. I want the general population to know. So yeah, and that would go
one second. I want to respond. Use a ridiculous example, right? So actually, what you said plays exactly into my point, right? We brought up Katrina and the militias that were helping, quote unquote, there. We know that many of those militia members murdered people with impunity, right? Just shot them in the fucking street.
Citation fucking needed, bud. What are you talking about? It was literally you're saying militias were running around murdering people?
Yes,
for fun?
Literally, yes. No, not for fun. People that they thought were looters or were looked weird coming to their neighborhood, they shot them. Right, we have records of this. right? So why would I? You brought up like a fucking perfect example of why I don't want militias, why I don't want these people having access to like
so
fucking
so
rifles and shit.
so it would actually be better for people who are in the middle of a grave natural disaster to be completely defenseless. Oh, okay, cool. It's actually better
Why would
for
I
the
want
government.
some
It's
group of
hold on,
crazies
because you said
asserting their
something really
authority
dumb.
over an area they have no right to assert
it would
authority
actually be
over.
better. It
It's
would
fucking
actually be
ridiculous.
better during a natural disaster for people to be defenseless and at the whim of anybody else who wanted to commit violence against them.
but
Yeah, that's what I
militias,
just fucking heard.
sending in
Okay, so
militias
the
like the fucking 3%ers, the Boogaloo Boys, the Proud Boys, or any of that shit, like that's not going to fucking help, dude. And by the way, like if you want data that you can't say isn't correlative, like if we look at the percentage of armed demonstrations that turn violent, that's about 16%. Unarmed demonstrations that turn violent, 3%. So that's per capita. That's adjusting for your like going up and going down as far as which.
It's the same correlative fallacy.
You don't understand how data like you have to break.
You don't understand how correlation and causation works.
I'll let Lorenzo respond because you also addressed him, and then we got to go to Mad Latin and Fanatic, who's been waiting patiently.
So I'm not proposing completely outlawing militias. If you want to get together with your buddies and LARP and like practice like firing ranges, whatever. It's when you're organized and you're going to things like protests and stuff like that. I feel like that would be a little that's where it gets kind of yikesy. Also,
how do we define that?
So also, militias do what the government can't do, right? So that's usually what we see militias do. Like for example, in Hurricane Katrina, the National Guard wasn't doing enough, so militias had to step in and kind of like, you know, supply this demand for help. So my solution to this would just be like get the government to like be better, like have the National Guard of each state, like I guess more well trained, and doing.
You know they have limited resources, right?
So do people.
Yeah, no shit. That's why I'm saying that like quintuple your resources by having a public-private partnership between communities.
You have fucking randos who aren't like trained. Like these people have to be held to high regard.
That's why they need to be well regulated. That's why they need to be well regulated.
Literally,
exactly. You're right. You're right.
So yeah, we need to train.
We don't want randos that are trained.
Right.
We want well regulated people so that it actually fits within the.
How will you regulate these militias? How do you regulate these militias?
We already mean well
My
trained.
goodness.
What is well trained? How do you know whether someone's well trained or not? You need like
I'm a veteran, so I know what training looks like.
I don't have an.
You need a central power to keep them in check. You need
Okay, so it sounds like I got you. So Lorenzo, it sounds like it's when you do not have to have a central power in order to keep them in check.
Okay, how do you want to regulate them?
What you can do is you can just come up with whatever standard you have for what well regulated is, and then those people just have to fit within those standards. We do this already when it comes to. How do we ensure that we do that. Well, the government would enforce that, but we do this already when it comes to things like we do that already when it comes to things like education, right? Where we say here is a standard of what education is, so you can't just have some person on homeschool whose only education is going to be the Bible, right? Like we already have standards, and then people have to meet those standards. That's what we're talking about here.
I'm clearly not arguing against you because I completely agree. The government should absolutely these militias can exist if they're completely regulated by the government. But Counterpoints and Rob are arguing the opposite. These militias should not be regulated by the government because if the government is tyrannical, then
just a quick question. I don't want to take a lot of time. Just a quick question to Nefarious here, real quick.
And we got Madlands, we're waiting. So it's gotta be extremely quick.
Super quick. You said you're okay with some militias, but just not the type that are showing up to these groups, and they need to be regulated so much. Who gets to make that decision for which type of militia is good and which type's not?
The government.
Right. So the check on tyrannical governments of militia, only the government can decide what militia is allowed.
Yes, you're right. Because I disagree with the fact that it's a check on the government. You're absolutely correct. That's the argument I was making.
Okay, let's go to Mad Latin. He's been waiting quite patiently, please.
So like, it's actually kind of astounding. I actually thought that the first time I got on a panel with Rob, I was going to have like sharp disagreements. And I do have one really sharp disagreement about January 6th, and we'll have to talk about that later. But in terms of like militias being a check on the government, that's actually like the entire point. Like that's actually legit. Like historically speaking, militias did exist as or has been incepted, like the creation of the militia. The idea of a militia was to act as a check against a tyrannical government. Historically speaking, it hasn't quite been used directly in that sense. A lot of the times the militia actually were used to establish government tyranny. In fact, if you look at the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, for example, George Washington marched the U.S. militia to rural Pennsylvania and put down a rebellion against taxing. So like, yeah, militias had that intent, but they haven't actually worked that way throughout history. I agree with the point that militias do need to be well regulated, because as Spectre is saying, folks who are just LARPing as militias, showing up to these protests and these rallies, are causing a lot more trouble than they are worth. But that would mean that we would want to have more training for these militias so that when they are present, it's not awful. Now, should the government be the ones to decide whether they're well regulated? It's kind of a hard thing that we'd have to actually kind
Who
of
decides
navigate.
that?
There's this
Can
thing.
y'all,
So
can
it's
y'all be
funny.
specific?
No, well, it would be the communities that decide how well regulated enough. If a
I know,
community
I
thinks a
do not
militia
trust
isn't,
those
does it, if a community thinks that a militia hasn't prepared enough, they probably don't want or won't accept the help of the militia,
how's the
right?
Okay, but then what?
gonna
No.
enforce
Because then
that?
there's no way for me to keep.
What do you mean? How do they
me-
enforce that?
There's no way
How
for
does
me
it
and my
be-
community to
They
be
have
like,
to
hey,
have
I
their
don't know.
militia.
Let me fucking talk, dude. There's no way for me and my community to be like, hey, I don't want the Proud Boys coming in here and fucking with my peaceful protest. The only way for me to do that is to go and, like, I guess join Antifa and do violence against them first, right? Like, how am I supposed to keep them out?
The
They
only
have
way to
freedom of
fight
speech,
guns
freedom
Hey,
of
is
assembly.
with militia.
No,
Or-
but no
or
one's,
even-
arguing,
or
no
even
one's arguing
worse,
that you
God-
should be able
God
to have the
forbid-
Proud Boys
God.
not be at your protest. Like, that's not the way things work. If we have freedom of speech here, if the Proud Boys want to assemble at a protest, they're absolutely allowed to do so. I don't think that
Well,
these
then I
things are
don't get to
mutually
decide which
exclusive.
militia comes into my community. Great, thank you.
I
Yeah,
don't know.
exactly.
I don't know who's
Shit,
dying
freedom
on that.
of
That sounds
movement.
really-
What the fuck?
Right,
Like,
I don't know
what
who's
are you
dying on
talking
that.
about?
I don't. I don't know how that's a win because I don't know anybody who would die on such a stupid hill. Clearly, like everyone has a freedom of movement. That's part of like our that's part of our
But-
right to assemble.
Hey, do you prefer
That's right.
violent protests or non-violent protests, Fanatic?
So if we get into preference, yeah, I probably would prefer nonviolent protests for the most part. However, as you already know, when it comes to specific black when it comes to black civil rights issues, it seems like violent protests tend to be significantly more effective. So while I prefer nonviolence as part of my ideology and my religion and part of what my moral compass is made up of, I understand that not everybody lives by my moral compass. So I understand why several people would decide to act violently, especially when it seems like the government is entirely inept
First of
at
all,
handling whatever the situations are.
Few things
Specifically when
here.
it comes to things like government entities like the police, I can totally understand if you know the history of police and their contingency with with black people, then it makes all the sense in the world why some people would want to get violent. So in those cases, it's not about my individual preferences.
So what I'm saying is when these militias show up at BLM protests, which is mostly what they've been showing up at, that's what most of these armed actions are, is a response to BLM protests from like 2020 to 2021, as far as we can tell. They are 16% of the time turning violent if there are guns there. That's only 3% of the time if there aren't guns there.
84%
So the
peaceful.
unarmed
Spectre, what's your
protesters are
problem?
being provoked. What?
It's 84% peaceful. It's mostly peaceful armed militias.
No, actually, it's
So-
94% peaceful, but it's only 84% when there's guns there. So fuck that. Get the guns out. You'll have more
Okay,
peaceful
what I'm
protests.
beaming
so
on
they're
is
still
you're not
primarily
showing me it's
peaceful.
been 93% peaceful fucking protests for BLM. So I guess because 7% of fucking protests turned violent for fucking BLM, we should ban protesting. This
No,
is like
we
the
should ban-
logical
we should ban
implication of what
guns
you're
because
saying.
that's what makes the protest violent.
No, it's
Okay,
not-
ban
it's
gun.
not true.
Okay, so ban
militias.
guns.
We should
Ban
we
guns.
should ban
So
militias
it's-
like the Boogaloo Boys
Wait.
and the Proud Boys from showing up.
Okay,
Uh-huh.
first off,
Your
so
16%
real
doesn't
quick,
show that.
yeah, real quick, there's still a problem with
16%
correlation and
versus
causation.
3%? So
There's still a problem with
16% when there's guns
correlation.
there, 3% when there's not guns there. That's not a correlation to you.
No,
Yes,
it's a correlation, but it's not
correlation.
causal.
How do you know it's
It's
correlation,
causal.
not causation? If you'll let me respond, I'll be able
Okay,
to.
you
So,
can
for
do it.
example, first off, the Proud Boys and the Boogaloo Boys, how are they a militia? What exactly defines them as a militia?
I believe that they define themselves as a militia. And then
I've never
also you got
heard
the
that.
3%ers, you got
Why
the
would you define
Oath
them?
Keepers.
Boys,
Like, I can
probably.
go down the list
So wait,
with
hold
you.
on. Do these groups only become militias when they pick up rifles? Like, what makes them
You
a
tell me.
militia in your
I'm not the one saying
Well-
that they don't have the right to assemble at certain events. So if you're going to say we need to keep them out, give me the definition of how you come to that decision.
I would declare
Okay.
them a like far right paramilitary group, and I would say that they're not allowed at peaceful protests with like
What
weapons.
makes them paramilitary? Most Proud Boys I've seen at rallies don't have AR-15s or guns. So why are they
But-
paramilitary?
But who even cares? How can you say that we're literally going to take a block of people because they're a part of an organization and ban them from assembling if they're doing
That's-
so
that's-
peaceably? If they
that's
if
the
they,
point,
if they,
Connor. They
if
can't
they
defi-
violate a crime, you can arrest them. But if you can't ban them from assembling in a group that represents a certain political interest, no matter how nefarious. This would even apply to neo-Nazis. If neo-Nazis
That's right.
showed up with guns, but then they didn't fucking hurt or kill anybody and they just stood there, then under the United States Constitution, they have the right to do so so, and the only time that you can interfere with those rights
I'm
is when they
aware.
start violating the law. This is like
I'm aware of
foundational
the-
Republican
stand
shit.
by let neo-Nazis
Now, if I can
stay
finish
on
my
this
point,
country.
please.
It's really cute.
I'm curious to
If I can finish my point.
and you can finish your point. I'll let you finish your point. But I'm curious to the panel in general. Maybe Rob can answer this too. Are the Bloods and the Crips, are they militia? I don't know.
I mean, they don't
Maybe
commit
they're different
crimes.
definitions.
No.
Go ahead, Rob.
I would say they're not a militia. No.
Why not?
I would say they're not a militia.
Because
Because
they're
they
actively
are
engaged in
not.
criminal
They do
activity.
not exist for the expressive purpose of training for things that a militia does. Right. So they consider they're not training for things like
Well, they used to be. That was
possibly
their
defending
intention.
themselves from tyrannical governments, from
No, they
providing
do.
first aid for people and things like that.
No, they do.
Well, then
no,
the Bloods and the Crips are
They
training
also
for
participate in
first
drug
aid.
trafficking and
Yeah.
fucking human
I
trafficking.
mean, if they
Like,
think
what are we
no.
talking about here?
Well, I mean, for some of them, and I won't harp on this point. I'm not going to make this like a big thing. But like, for a lot of these groups, especially when they formed, right? It was for like self-defense against like the police, coming in their neighborhoods, because they couldn't trust them because systematic racism. But won't have that conversation now. But yeah, that's the thing that they did. Now. What exactly they do now, maybe not so much, but like I don't know. I think that's part of it anyway. Is to say that the police victimize us, and so I'm going to take back my power and also drugs. So.
All right.
Black
So,
Panther Party
anyways,
stuff is an
to
example
finish
of
my
it.
point real quick, first, just to speak to that, sure, the Bloods and the Crips, if they haven't committed crimes, they have like, I don't think that if you identify as a Blood, that means that you shouldn't be allowed to go to a rally, right? But clearly, that's something different than what we consider militia, at least the way they operate now. But all I want to point out is when I ask how people define a militia, because there are people here saying we don't want militias of this type to show up to these groups. They can't give a definition. They can't give a definition. We'll give you a chance in a second. I already asked. We'll give you a chance. But for example, we heard Proud Boys, right? The point is, and you hear people like DeFerry say, well, the government should make that decision. So what we have now is a government that we have a militia that stands as a check on tyranny from them that now gets to decide who's allowed to freely assemble and who's allowed to have the right to have the Second Amendment and things like that, and how they will arbitrarily make that. And the proof is that we have people like Spectre and Nefarious going, yeah, like the Proud Boys. They shouldn't be allowed to be there. The reality is, the people that are making this argument, let's be quite fucking clear. We have all this, real quick, I'm going to make the correlation causation. Yeah, probably when the Proud Boys and other groups are showing up, there's more likely to be violence because the vast majority of Black Lives Matter rallies occurred in little towns like I live in Clarion, Pennsylvania, where there was no disagreement or anything. But when you have bigger rallies, such as those in D.C., Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Minneapolis, Portland, Seattle, etc., the ones that engage in violence, yes, you're going to attract people on the other side that want to have violence, and those people are all more likely to be armed on both sides. Which is explain correlation causation. And the last thing I'll say is that what you see is Kyle Rittenhouse proved the exact reason why you want a well-regulated militia and why we need to have people defend themselves, because so many of these people on the left defended the violence that was occurring in these riots and things like that. And not just the people on these panels, actually prominent politicians, media members, etc. And they said that they didn't want the National Guard or the police there. Well, then that's the perfect example of why a militia needs to exist, but not necessarily just fighting the government. Militias can exist to protect their own communities because so many people, including, I'm guessing, people on this panel, were perfectly fine with the violence being enacted on those communities.
And you know what?
So the people were forced to come together and arm themselves to
Rob
protect their
actually
community.
just
No.
made
Kyle
my
Rittenhouse
point.
didn't stop any damage
I'm
to the
sorry,
community.
Hold on. I'm going to cut in here because Rob just made my point. This is exactly what I wanted to get at, actually. Yes, you can form a militia to protect your own interests against other aspects of the American population. Absolutely. But those other aspects of the American population are going to form their own militias to counter the initial militias. That's where I'm going.
shit.
Like, you're going to have...
But
You're going to have,
Good.
if this continues, you're going to have left-wing militias challenging right-wing militias directly.
But
in
this
the
isn't
street.
happening. This isn't happening.
It
The
hasn't
vast
happened
no,
yet.
no.
That's very different.
77% of the people who show up armed to these protests are on the right, not the left. Like this
Correct.
idea that
I
Antifa
agree.
is showing up with guns all over the place
I
is
thought
fucking
the percentage
ridiculous.
was-
And by the
I'm
way,
saying-
like, so I think that it was perfectly justified for Kyle to defend himself against somebody who was pointing a gun at him. That being said, he did not defend any property while he was there. He defended his life. So don't act like he's like fucking defending.
Why was
like,
he there?
the stuff from getting
Why
burned
did he
down.
show up?
Let me ask you a question. So Spectre, here's where we run into the problem, right? Because we see different militia groups go with different intentions. Like, there are white accelerationists who are like in militia that are going there to to create violence and make those things happening, right? But you can't then use that to color all militias, right? So you have like the NFAC. I don't remember any violence tied to any of the things that they were doing, right? They were showing up specifically in response to people who are, in some cases, protesters who were being threatened by different entities in the government, and they were like, okay, no, we're going to show up and we're going to make sure that nothing untoward happened. I remember there was one of the Congress members who they started escorting, said they can go to work during the very beginning of the lockdown, specifically because that woman was being threatened by different militia groups, right? So it depends on what the intentions are of that.
No,
I think it's really insane to just write off the entire thing.
But here's the thing: is that we can know what the intentions are because Rob, didn't we find out that the FBI had actually infiltrated most of these far right paramilitary groups before January 6th?
Well, that's a good question. The FBI claims that there wasn't a plot that was discovered before, but I think what we're going to find out is actually, yes, the FBI was involved in some of these groups and
they
probably
groups,
knew
so
what was going down
which
before.
ones are starting violence at protests too, yeah?
Right, like Antifa, Black Lives Matter. Yeah, I agree. They know,
So
they
you
just
tell them to
selectively
stay the fuck
enforce.
out, yeah.
Right, they selectively
Are they
choose.
in Black Lives Matter? Is that who stormed the Capitol?
So you're who stormed the White House on May 30th, 31st, 2020? Who stormed it? Was it the Proud Boys?
No one stormed.
No, you don't know about that incident. You don't know. You don't know when they called Trump a bunker bitch because people burned down a guard station outside the White
He
House.
went to a bunker, yeah, but nobody stormed the White House.
Nobody stormed the White House.
They attempted to, but
Oh my
law enforcement
god,
stopped
can we
them.
not do the kid thing? I'm bad, but what are you? Like, can we not do that shit? Can we just admit that
No,
motherfuckers
it's not
can be
like kids
violent on
making,
either
right,
side? Holy
Connor?
The only
shit.
point that I was making
if I may,
is that Rob has acknowledged that the FBI has already infiltrated these far right
Most of them.
paramilitary groups, so we know which ones are violent. We can label them as such, keep them the fuck out of protest. That's all.
Hey,
Wait,
Fanatic,
wait,
do you
hold
think,
on,
Fanatic,
stop
real
this,
quick,
stop
let me
this,
ask
stop
Fanatic a
this.
question. Do you think that it's possible
we
for...
gotta, hold
Can
on,
I ask Fanatic...
Hold on. We will
said
let
it
you
like
ask the
6
question.
fucking
Yeah.
times.
So let's go to counterpoints and then Nefarious.
Spectre,
Then.
do you think that United States citizens, based off of affiliation with political groups, regardless of whether or not they're violent, should be legally barred from assembling in the general public for the sake of political protest? And if so, are you
firearm,
okay?
yes.
Wait, hold on. Okay. And if so, let's say, with a firearm, yes, then that's up to the municipalities who govern these regions. But okay, number one. And then number two, are you comfortable saying this about like gang organizations, for instance? So for instance, if the Bloods or the Crips wanted to come together for a fucking, hey, the Bloods are the fucking best gang that's ever existed, and the only people who have firearms are Bloods who don't have felonies, and the only people who don't have firearms are people who have like fucking criminal convictions, and they have the right to assemble and basically say, hey, we're the best organization ever. Drink our fucking lemonade or some shit. It's a fucking grill out. You want the government to be able to legislate whether or not they're able to assemble in public?
Wait, hold on.
they
We already
basically
have that
already
right
do.
now. Right? Yeah. Like if you're already part of like specific organizations, like or if you're like convicted with certain felonies and things, the government already has a jurisdiction to be able to tell you you're not allowed to assemble politically. That's what happens when it comes to certain people. You lose some of your rights when you're
treat
convicted
the
for
Proud
certain
Boys
things.
like the Bloods.
Hey,
That's the thing.
Fanatic, can I ask you a question real quick? Do you see
you'll get to-
a chance for the NFAC?
No. We got to move on. Don't worry.
Okay.
I promise you, Rob. We'll get back to you. Go ahead, Nefarious, Mazat, and DB too.
So this idea that the government can't regulate any of its checks and balances and stuff like that comes from a position in which I believe is just like an apparent lack of knowledge in like political science. The government does actively regulate all of its checks and balances, right? We look at like the 3 branches of government. The Supreme Court will like regulate like the Constitution and stuff like that, and will keep the judicial branch and stuff like that in check. So just because the militias are designed to be like a way of regulating government and a check and balance for government doesn't mean that the government can't regulate them.
But you're talking about the
government doesn't regulate things all the time. Look at
That's
crony
like the first
capitalism.
fucking thing.
Look at the state of crony capitalism right now, right? I love capitalism; it's the best system in the world. But crony capitalism is absolutely problematic, and the only people who are in the position to regulate, to prevent some of the nonsense from happening, are Congress themselves, but they are the problem. They are the ones being paid by the lobbyists. So then at this point, like, sure, maybe the government can regulate itself, but we see Congress has the ability to like create raises for itself, to regulate how many holidays it gets and things like that. And I don't see anything in what branch of the government has any right to stop them from that. It seems like that's something that's unchecked, right?
And
So
listen, to make Fanatic's point even more, right? Like, Fanatic, can you see a situation where we
made
would...
the point. Let Nefarious respond. I don't need you to make.
Thanks for moderating, Fanatic. Can you see the point? Can you see?
I'm gonna ignore you. I want
This is anti-white racism. Stop it, Fanatic.
After he responds, then you can say whatever question you've been begging to ask.
Well, I don't have a question for you. Fuck off, you're worthless anyway. Sorry for giving you benefit of the doubt. Perpetual victim Fanatic also being the moderator here.
I am
use my pro.
Okay. You guys said what I had to say. I said it well. I don't need you to clarify. You can't speak for me. I spoke to Nefarious.
Not speaking, Fanatic. It's someone else's turn to speak, Fanatic. Not speaking, it's someone else's turn.
We got it. Loud noises accomplished. Loud noises accomplished. Nefarious, respond, and then respond. Madla and Doobie, Problematic Pan, and then Rob Noerr.
Thank you.
So yeah, if you want to have a discussion on lobbying, that's a completely separate issue, and I disagree with what you just said. But like, I don't want to get into that debate now because it's really long. We can definitely talk about it after, though, Fanatic, if you're willing to do that.
Okay, let's go to Madlad.
All right, so back to the whole like whether we can decide whether folks can meet up or not. So there are laws in the United States against treason, sedition, and rebellion, right? So if like there's a militia that's acting like, in a way that might be rebellious in nature, like, I'm just going to read the specific wording. Let's see, conspire to overthrow, put down, or destroy by force the government of the United States, or levy war against them, or oppose by force the authority thereof, or by force prevent, hinder, or delay the execution of any law in the United States, or by force seize, take, or possess any property of the United States contrary to the authority thereof, things happen, right? So like if a militia is acting in a way that is specifically against the interests of American authority, then yeah, the government already has a privilege to remove these militias and do whatever it is that they're entitled to do. In terms of whether we should have militias participating in protests and all this other stuff, like Spectre raises a very good point. You've got these individuals showing up to defend property, but then end up having to shoot in self-defense because folks are coming at them instead of the property. Fine, whatever. Like, I don't know how you want to justify like what actually happened there in Kenosha, but like, either
it was
way,
self-defense. It was totally justified. Like,
but the fact of the matter is, if he wasn't there as a target, then there's like, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole because then we get into like all sorts of things, right?
Yeah, but there are no laws in place at the time. I'm saying that we should have laws in place to prevent outside actors from coming in with guns. That's
right, and like, so I agree with that. And then, but I also agree with if we can't get those laws on the books, and if we can't find a way of preventing these sorts of militias from coming out in force, then I do think that a left-wing militia is justified. And I would love to see how that would work. Like, I actually am all about it.
Well, let's go to Doobie, Problematic Pan, Rob.
So this is depressing. So I think just using Connor's like natural disaster, right? Example again, right? So you're telling me that you guys here on this panel, Fanatic, I'm going to use you. You'd be okay with the Proud Boys, getting together with rifles and showing up in your community to quote unquote, keep the peace. Or Connor, you'd be okay with the fucking Antifa anarchist goblins showing up in your community, right? To keep the peace and assert their dominance over whatever.
Yeah, can I answer this directly?
Yes.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I think that a lot of political organizations that are libertarian or anarchist in particular actually share a lot of value sets, and they're confused about who their opponents are. So when it comes to like libertarians or anarchists or NFAC or anything like that, you would actually find like a pretty extreme common thread, which would be like liberty, independence of government, skepticism of authority, all of that kind of stuff. And if anything, what I would want to do, I'm not kidding about this, is if I ever do have enough of a platform or money to do it, I would like to assemble a small range day between like all of these different groups. That way we could go over gun safety, talk to each other about politics, grill out, actually get to know each other, all that kind of shit. And not only that, I think it would be good to do it on a community level, basically like based off of the city that you're in. That way, not only do you understand that you don't have to kill the rival militias in your territory, but maybe you can coordinate for mutual aid in the event of a natural disaster. Maybe you can coordinate with people who are fucking political enemies, but can come together for the good of the community. So, for instance, Spectre and I have talked about this in the past. He's living in Texas now. He's a filthy fucking leftist, and I should hate him, but I don't because he's a beautiful soul. And basically, when time comes and I have a little bit of extra scratch, we're gonna get together and we're gonna do some mutual aid shit because, frankly, that's the kind of example that we need to set in this space. So yeah, I do think it's good to assemble these militias. Yes, I do think it's good to train. And yes, I do think that there's a real opportunity to do some community building. So yeah, Antifa might be a bunch of gross fucking basement dwelling gremlins, but I'll teach them how to fucking shoot and I'll incorporate them into my mutual aid community development project. 100%.
Okay,
So
so when you've done this, right, and then the next Jacob Blake happens, right, and you guys have a disagreement, right, a genuine disagreement about something that's happened, and they think this is an example of white supremacy and the government being tyrannical, and yada yada yada. So they show up in a community to burn shit down with these rifles you've taught them to use, and you show up in the same town with the rifles to protect the town. We're supposed to be okay with the tension here and expect that people aren't going to be shot in the street.
Hopefully
Right,
based off of prior hold on. Based off of prior community engagement, I hope we would be able to get past that. But then do you know the meme of like the crying boy with the gun who's like he's super sad that he looks like he has to like shoot something?
Yeah, I got it.
No, I don't.
Good joke.
Okay. All right. Then it'll be one of those, and it just is what it is.
To answer the question you asked me earlier, I have
So-
literally no problem with the Proud Boys assembling in my neighborhood or any other neighborhood. I believe in I believe in freedom of speech, and I believe in the right to assemble. So sure, they can show up and do whatever the freak that they want. They can.
No, I
they
think
can
you misheard.
assemble. I would never stop that.
You understand that usually
hold
what
on,
they
wait,
do
wait,
is
one
beat the
second.
hell out of
So-
BLM protesters.
So
one second.
we'll
I think you-
let you be finished, then we'll go to Pan. He's been waiting so long. Then Noor, and then we'll go to you, Spectre, as well. And then Nefaris and Mad Lab, yeah.
Yeah, so Fnatic, I think you misheard me. So I was pointing to Connor's example of like Katrina and militia showing up there, and I mentioned that some of those militia members murdered people after Katrina. So what I said is, if there were a natural disaster at like a Katrina level in your neighborhood, right, where the police weren't able to show up to help, would you be okay with a group like the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or any of these like far right groups showing up with rifles and keeping the peace or trying to like assert their dominance in your community and their authority in your community?
Well, so I wouldn't be necessarily okay with them showing up, but it depends on. I would be okay with different militia groups that are like, depending on what their goal is or what their stated purpose is, right? Like obviously, if like the justice of the peace isn't like going to be the ones there I'm supposed to be having. I don't know. Whatever their stated goals are, then that's what's going to like determine whether or not I'm okay with them being there in those situations. I do think clearly like different groups have different purposes, and if they're just showing up randomly and murdering people and doing all sorts of nonsense, then that's not their actual like forte. Then yeah, I don't want them there. Like, but that's not an argument against militias in general. It's just an argument against that specific one.
So go ahead, Pan.
We literally agree.
Well, I don't think we do agree, because what Fnatic, or at least not, I'm not going to speak for Fnatic. What I'm saying is, yeah, if these groups want to come in and help us recover from a natural disaster, I'm definitely going to be okay with that, right? Like, yes, a lot of times. What do you mean? What if they're coming in?
Even if they're nefarious.
Well, I mean, yeah, if the reason they're coming in is because there's a natural disaster and they want to be of assistance to the people in that community, I have no problem with that. Because if this is about helping, I mean that.
What?
Let's use Antifa then, all right? Let's use Antifa. Let's use some really anti-white group, okay? First of all, if the group's anti-white enough, they're not going to come help me after a natural disaster. If they hate me, I don't see why they would come to help me after a natural disaster. So, like, I'm going to assume that if anyone's willing to, go into a territory where there's been a natural disaster and willing to help the occupants there, they probably don't hate the occupants. Maybe that's naive of me, but I don't see why anyone would do that.
Sure, but problematic Pan, have you seen any examples in which people have stated that they're there to help, but in reality what they've done is harm? Is that a possibility?
I mean, sure, of course it's a possibility.
Sorry, Pan, the community needs your furniture, Pan. We just got to get it and take it and give it to everybody because everybody has a need right now. That's what I'd do if I had a crazy ass militia. I'd show up in your community. It's like, hey, sorry, yeah, times are tough. We're gonna take your shit. Like, why would
do you understand that typically laws restored? What the fuck are we talking about?
No, we're talking
about the law. The government doesn't break down in perpetuity. What the fuck are we talking about?
No, we're talking about Katrina. Like, this literally happened.
It doesn't matter if it's in perpetuity. It doesn't matter if it's in perpetuity. It matters if even in that instance, just while the militia is there, during the height of wherever the problem is, if there's all sorts of nonsense and nefarious actors carrying out God knows what, then it's problematic, right?
Yeah, and
walking down the wrong street.
I didn't hear his response. Right, Connor?
It's a combination of evils. You have to pick the lesser of the evils. Like,
do you think it's a lesser? Do you think it's a lesser evil to have nefarious actors showing up with like insane biases, overt biases, like wreaking additional havoc on people in the middle of a freaking crisis?
May I respond?
Yes, that's bad. Like what?
Right? No, it's not just is that bad. Do you think it's the lesser of two evils? Because I would rather. I think that
depends. If the option is starving or not getting water and people not being able to communicate and other people getting murdered, then yeah, it's the lesser of two evils. Yeah.
Or if you're a black man, you get shot for walking down the wrong street.
Form a black militia, you fucking pussy! Holy shit!
If these people have nefarious enough intentions in those situations, then the idea becomes that yes, like, I'm sorry, they're not doing any good. They're not bringing water, or they're only bringing water to white citizens. Like, let's say we have some incredibly bad actors who I said had overt biases, who decided, yes, in the height of Katrina, we're just going to tax niggas and make sure that we like protect white people because they're incredibly biased. Do you think
those would be crimes and they would still be prosecuted? What the fuck are we talking about?
I think we've heard Fanatic ramble on long enough, man.
Of course, you said justice would be.
Oh, you said of course 4 times. Great. I'll just start interrupting. I can do that. I can start interrupting.
Everyone, I want Fanatic to finish this, and then we're going to go to Rob Noerr, Nefarious. And Nefarious,
please, Fanatic, you bring so much wisdom.
You don't need to raise your hands. And then Matt Latin, yeah, don't worry, I got you all.
Thank you. Now kindly shut the hell up while I finish my statement. While of course I understand that eventually justice will be restored, but what I made, the statement that I made earlier was that in the interim, like while at the height of the thing, before justice is restored, when the resources are like divvied to other things and we don't have any control over the situation, they would be wreaking havoc on those citizens during that time. Can you understand why that would be so insanely problematic?
Yes, and I would have a solution, which would basically be like the community-based coordination, building community bonds, alternative militias, like all of that shit. So I'm kind of missing the broader point.
Yeah, we're supposed to erect that in the middle of a crazy.
No, you're supposed to do it now.
Okay,
do it now before a crisis occurs.
Good point, Fanatic. Keep going, Fanatic. Good point.
Right now, I will shut the hell up. I will shut the hell up.
I'll translate. I'm black. I'm a victim. Go ahead.
Right now, right now, right? You're saying yes, that's something we should do right now. But we can obviously say in most populations, right now, we don't actually have those things in place. So in the cases like Hurricane Katrina, which already happened, we saw that they didn't have those things and they couldn't assemble those things. They're literally fighting for survival. So then there's this idea that these things would just automatically fix themselves, or that your solution would be applicable in real time in the middle of some nefarious actors is unrealistic, right?
Yeah, that would be a good counterpoint if I said any of that shit, but I didn't say any of that. No, I didn't. I said, let's start now. What the fuck are you talking about, bud?
Sure. Yeah, okay. All right. Let's go to Rob. I think I skipped Spectre, so Spectre, then Nefarious, and Mattline.
Oh, wow. I was really enjoying Fanatic basically say fucking nothing over and over again. But hey, that's what he's like on panel, so we get a good dose of it. So to answer Fanatic's point succinctly, yes, if people show up and they commit crimes, then yes, we should punish them for committing those crimes. The problem is, how do you determine who's allowed to assemble and who's not allowed to assemble? For example, Gage Grosskreutz from the ACLU and Rosenbaum, etc. Well, Well, we saw Kenosha lit on fire for 2 days previous to when we saw people show up like Rittenhouse. So should they have been told, you can't come here? We can't have Black Lives Matter here because they've committed fires and hurt this community for the past 3 days? Anyone, a show of hands that third day that Rittenhouse showed up, a show of hands that says that Black Lives Matter shouldn't have been allowed to be there that day.
If they were actually burning stuff down and destroying property, they should have been sent home. Absolutely.
The whole organization, correct?
Wait, are you?
The whole organization should have been back, correct?
Are you kidding, Lorenzo?
They were violating a curfew, to be clear. So yeah, they shouldn't have been
They
there.
were. Yeah, it was completely illegal. Those rioters shouldn't have been there. 100%.
So Black Lives Matter shouldn't have been there. Great God. So we're good there. So yes, if people are violating specific crimes, they should be removed. Totally agree. Now, Madland's definition of when we have laws, when the U.S. government can come in, talks about groups that want to usurp and damage the property of the United States, the ideology, or the sort of mechanisms and ideology of the United States. We've seen many examples of that. For example, we've seen police precincts, which is a government building, burnt down. So therefore, those would be terrorist groups by definition that the U.S. military, according to the definition MadLab provided, should have been gone in and treated them like terrorists. In addition, we saw Antifa take over in Seattle, take over 6 cities. Please, I gave everyone a long block to talk. We saw them take over 6 city blocks in Seattle.
Me the entire time. Shut up.
No, we let you go, you fucking whiny bitch. I let you go, you whiny bitch.
Shut up. Don't ever get indignant about it after you've been
Okay. Got it.
Now, may I continue?
Yes, please.
So we saw them take over actual 6 city blocks, and we saw that the local municipality said, it's the summer of love, no problem. Then they actually murdered a young African-American boy. That's what happened to the Chaz Zone. When the FBI was asked about that, they said, Antifa, what's that? It's just an idea. So we can see how this would be falsely applied. The question I was trying to ask Fanatic, but I have no interest in hearing him answer because he just turned it into, I'm black, I'm a victim, and screaming or something, was this. Can we see a situation where we would have left-wing groups that the FBI could infiltrate and say, oh, they've engaged in poor behavior, therefore they're no longer allowed to assemble? Yes, we could, because we saw that happen with the Vietnam War, and we saw it happen with groups like Happy Hoffman and the people he had previously. So the idea that we could say, well, the FBI can infiltrate groups and they'll decide which groups are good or bad. Sure. And it's not beyond the FBI to put informants there to encourage bad behavior or to just false flag-based bad behavior to then say, okay, this group doesn't have the right to exist. The last thing is I love the idea of saying like, well, we're against the Proud Boys, etc., because we wouldn't want the Proud Boys. Then we might have to cheer for Antifa showing up. The Proud Boys exist as a response to Antifa. What happened was we saw left-wing violence occur over and over again, right? And then people said, we're fed up with this. Now, I'm not saying everyone who behaves in these militias are good people. I'm not saying that. But they felt the reason there is public perception that they are necessary is because there has been so much left-wing violence that people in positions of power on the left, including police chiefs, mayors, etc., have endorsed or ignored that people felt the need to defend their own property. I talked about Rittenhouse. Someone said he didn't defend property, he defended himself. Well, the reason he was there was to defend the property. And we see this occur over and over. We keep talking about at Katrina, there were bad actors. Those actors should have been punished. That's not a reason to say that militias shouldn't be able to exist. And the problem is, why are we selective in saying when this can occur? Because we saw riots. For example, we knew in Minneapolis, night 3 after George Floyd, there were going to be riots. So should they have said that any group that seeks to have a peaceful protest isn't allowed to be there because we think there are outside nefarious actors within their group? No, that would have been outrageous. Those outraged over the death of George Floyd absolutely had the right to peacefully protest. To say that they would be dissuaded. The last thing I'll say real quick is they can't define what a militia is. They seem to say firearms are necessary for a militia. Many Black Lives Matter and Antifa people were armed as well. For example, the person that shot David Dorn. There were other people like Dave Grosskreutz actually did have an illegal firearm that was there for Black Lives Matter. The point is, there's an arbitrary distinction saying we don't want the Proud Boys there, who's not a militia group. We don't want these other groups there. But that if we gave the government the power to tell them they can't be there, they wouldn't misuse it and say Black Lives Matter couldn't be. They would never do that. That's naive. It's stupid. The government will go against any group that they feel is a legitimate threat to their public perception.
Let's go to
I managed to write all this down.
Spectre, Nefarious, Malat, and Doobie, and then
all right. So now that you're done gish galloping, Rob, I managed to get all of that down. So first of all, you're right. The left does show up armed with these things. About 13% of the people that are armed are on the left. Rest are on the right. So you know what? Make all the ones that are causing trouble go home. I'm cool with that. Still hits the side that is causing the issue more home. Again, 84% of the action that has been taken by these militias that are mostly right-wing has been showing up to BLM protests against them for the past 2 years. They make the protest more violent as a result. If you can show me an Antifa cell that is having this effect on protest as well, I am more than happy with you telling them that they are not allowed to fucking gather there. That's
You have
fine.
not demonstrated that they're more violent. They make it more violent.
Yes.
You have not demonstrated that they make it more violent. You had this.
I think that 13% disparate and outcomes.
Okay, but you do realize that just because there was more people with guns that went to violent rallies, that could be because when rallies are more violent, there's going to be more people who show up with guns as a countermeasure,
How do you have
right?
a predictability for when a riot is going to be more violent?
Because
you
it
don't have a
happened night after night.
predictability. You see it, like it's happening there.
I'm saying that. So no. Look. So they literally test for 16%, per capita, basically, of the violent ones, of the ones where people show up with guns, rather, turn violent. 3% of the ones where people don't show up with any guns are the ones that turn violent. So it's 97% versus 84% being peaceful, right?
How did they know who had guns? What if they were concealed?
What?
For example, let me just give you a quick example. Let's say that there is a Black Lives Matter rally in my town. There is no violence whatsoever, but it turns out 80% of the people there had concealed weapons. They just didn't feel the need to bring them out because there was no violence.
Do you think that it's probably the fact that they're brandishing the weapons and threatening people with them and yelling obscenities at them that makes these things more likely to become violent sometimes? So yeah, I guess if you can see...
You're adding qualifiers.
Well, I mean, if you have evidence of Proud Boys brandishing their weapons at people and insulting them while they do that, let's get them off the street. That is a crime.
The disparate outcomes
No. So
from the data.
Look,
I'm not going to go and
the data doesn't show that. You need to understand.
And I can find you videos of Proud Boys doing violent shit at protests. That is not difficult. I'm not going to go.
That's not what I asked for. I asked for evidence of what you claimed, that they were brandishing weapons and then threatening, people with them. That's what I need evidence for. And also, yes, if you can know beforehand, hey, things at this rally are likely to get pretty hairy tonight. I'm going to bring a firearm. That's more like you don't. That's not more likely. There's no way to know.
There's no way to predict which 6% of the protests are going to be the violent ones. I'm sorry, this is an absurd claim. Actually, there is a way. There's a way. There is a way to predict if a protest is more likely to get violent. You want to know what it is? If you fucking bring a gun to it.
Okay,
hold on. So
there was no way to see on day 3 of Kenosha that it was going to be a relatively violent protest. There was no way beforehand.
We gotta go. We're gonna go to sorry, Nefarious, Mad Latin, Doobie, Pan, and I'm guessing Counterpoints supposed to jump in there at some point. Yeah.
Okay, so I haven't interrupted. I've just written everything down. So try your best not to interrupt me while
That's
I
not gonna
deliver
work,
this point.
but go ahead.
So I'm really against violence. I think violence is really stupid most of the time, and that's why I don't like the Black Bloc, for example. Not the whole of Antifa, but definitely the violent parts of Antifa. And that's also why I don't really like militias. It does seem like they produce cyclical violence. Second of all, you can't really ban BLM the movement. I guess if you want to ban BLM the organization from those riots, but everyone was banned, right? Because it was a curfew, so it was illegal for anyone to be there. Third of all, this might just be because I'm a European cuck, but Americans have a really, really weird fascination with doing everything just themselves instead of using the government to help them. All of these problems, the Hurricane Katrina and stuff like that, all come from a lack of government intervention. The government was just shitty and couldn't help that much. That's why militias had to step in. So surely the response here wouldn't be for more militias, but it would be for more government actions and improving the government. Fourth of all, I'm pro mutual aid completely. I like communities standing up for themselves and helping each other and stuff like that. But I'm not really pro militia, and it kind of just sounds like you're defining militias as people who just get together and just happen to have guns, because that's kind of and if that's your definition for a militia, then yeah, I wouldn't ban them. I don't think you could ban them. I don't think you can ban people just getting together and also just having firearms. But militias for me are kind of organizations with the sole purpose of using violence and stuff like that to curb, imagine tyrannical government activity or whatever. But if you're using a different definition, I'll concede that. Portugal. I live in Portugal.
Okay, gotcha.
So to clarify, if I can, just my position here, I'm perfectly fine with militias. It's just I think they should be regulated, and the ones that are demonstrated to get out of hand should be told to go the fuck home. That's it.
When you say regulated, do you mean legally regulated, or do you mean trained? What do you mean?
I mean, I guess if we want to train them and then kick out the people that are you know what the Proud Boys do for training right now, for example, right? With the beating the shit out of each other in a circle,
Yeah,
well, it's not a militia.
Okay.
Yeah, let's go to Mad Latin, GB, Pan, and then Counterpoints, I think, wants to say something.
It's so absurd to say that like the Proud Boys aren't a militia when we're loosely so you're like loosely defining what a militia is when it suits your purposes, Rob, and then you're just finding it very
BLM a militia?
strictly.
No, it's a
Fact is-
movement.
Are they
There's
even an
travel.
organization?
13% of the people that show up armed.
I mean,
They
like,
do.
right.
BLM.
So okay, so if BLM is a militia, then Proud Boys aren't. Like, I have no idea what the hell. Like,
Define
what you're doing
militia.
here. A militia is is an organized group of folks with weapons that do things with those weapons. We'll say. Well, I'll give it very loose, like very straightforward. Like that's probably what a militia is, right? Like people who use their weapons for a specific purpose, whether that is for training or for guarding things, etc., etc.
Does it have to
I
be
don't-
guns?
I mean, unless we're living in the medieval era.
No,
Like,
why
we-
not? What if
we
I
live in
make
the-
bombs? What if a bunch
That-
of people are armed with bombs
Okay,
or
whoa,
Molotov
okay.
cocktails?
So Molotov cocktails and bombs are not weapons that you would find in a militia. Bombs and Molotov cocktails are weapons you would find in, say, terror cells, right? Like, it's quite different. Like, very different.
Why?
You can't
If you've
train
trained to make them,
Not really.
it seems to be arbitrary. If the argument is training with
I
weapons
mean,
and, and then
okay,
using them.
So, like, I mean, if we want to be, I mean, I guess weapons might be a little too broad. I can tighten the definition and say weapons that can be used to guard and defend, like, property or something along those lines. I guess we could say.
So just
I mean,
real quick
I'm just
then.
like, yeah.
So just
sure.
real quick, so the Black Lives Matter organization as a whole, it's very loose and stuff like that. But let's say six friends get together and they say we are all marching for the cause of Black Lives Matter, and we all have handguns, and we're going out to train to use those handguns in case horrible cops or horrible white supremacists attack us. Are they a militia?
I would say that group of six very specifically are. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
You probably need more people to be I don't think I'd be comfortable with saying
Oh,
like
guys,
6
guys,
people.
can I just hit you in?
No,
Hold on, really
I don't
quick.
get derailed. Fuck that. I don't
Okay.
get derailed. All right. Well, okay. Counterpoints, real quick. You wanted to say something about this?
Oh, good luck with that. Counter.
Oh, I was just gonna say the federal definition for militia. There's the regulated militia and the unregulated militia. The regulated militia is actually the National Guard. The unregulated militia is males between the ages of 1745 and females who are enlisted in the National Guard. That's all I wanted to offer.
Females are unregulated? Okay, all right. That's interesting.
Yeah, no,
That's good.
females are not part of the militia
Most
unless they're a
are.
part of the National Guard.
Okay.
Wow. That's.
So I would yeah.
So
I'd
I
be
mean,
down
I
with
guess,
training up like that civilian populace
Yes.
to actually act as a supporting actor to the National Guard. By the way, Connor, I think that'd be a good way to get people like out of the more extreme militias. So there you go.
Let's go.
Right.
Oh,
and,
now
I,
that I'm
and
finished.
I'm like all about that. So I'm all about that. Like I think that we should have more regulation in terms of the militias, and it doesn't have to be even like just government saying, "Hey, this is allowed and this is not allowed." It should be training. That being said, I see a future where we don't take these steps, and I see these militias getting more and more out of hand over the next decade, and I see a future where there's going to be all sorts of militia groups that spring out. Like this whole Kyle Rittenhouse case has justified a lot of right-wing rhetoric regarding militias, and there's going to be more right-wing militias acting out and doing things like when protests arrive, which they will be happening throughout 2022, 23, I think. And when we've got more actors shooting more people at protests, you're going to find that the side that's being shot at will respond in kind. Historically speaking, you see it all the time. Like I would go into it very deep, but I want to give us time to let other people get
Yeah,
it.
everyone's nodding their head. That's great. That's why you should have cheered for the police to stop the riots occurring on the left.
Let's go to
Well, I think most of
Let's go Doobie, Pan, Counterpoints, and then Fanatic. We're gonna give Fanatic some space too.
Yeah, so I actually agree with Rob, surprisingly. So, and Lorenzo, I think the answer is more government, right? It's the government cracking down much more harshly on rioters, on protesters who are like staying out past curfew, right? And putting themselves into situations where violence starts to occur, at dark. Like this seems like
Bringing to Congress.
It seems like you have hold on. Yeah, it seems like you have the answer in your hand, right? It's more government, more police, more calling of the National Guard when things get hairy.
Yeah.
This is totally fine to me, right? I don't see how any of this indicates that we need more LARPers running around in body armor with fucking AR-15s, right? So if you're contention is that the lefties weren't calling for Antifa to be arrested when they're burning down buildings, so people had to go out with the rifles. Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's a reasonable response to your community being burned down. Yeah, totally reasonable. So yeah, you cut this off at the bud, right? And you send in the National Guard immediately when shit starts going crazy. But again, there's no indication there to me that the solution to any of this is empowering more people, or any people who don't have training, who are civilians, to form militias and show up at protests or rallies or at natural disasters to assert any kind of authority anywhere. Right. So, I think, right now, if you guys are going to define militias as loosely as like, a bunch of people who get together and happen to have guns, we can't really do anything better right now. We need to get rid of the Second Amendment, or massively amend the Second Amendment, which I definitely want to do. We got to take their toes away.
But you just gave them reasoning for why not to do that. But you just said that, the police should have done this, but they didn't.
So we should encourage our government officials in your beautiful democracy to have the police do this, right? To call in the National Guard when people are burning buildings down and shit. Like, I don't understand.
Yeah, but
they're doing a bad thing. Let's do this other bad thing in response.
But as established, they're 13% less likely to start burning.
Spectre, we get it.
Rob, 5 seconds.
Right, we get it, Spectre. It's all the Proud Boys. They did everything. There was no left-wing violence.
Oh my, Spectre, please stop using that.
It doesn't matter. Listen,
incorrect.
The statistic. Let me respond to this real quick. The statistic you're citing doesn't say what you think it is, as we've already pointed out. Even if it did, it's irrelevant. Even if it did, it's irrelevant. It's to if those armed people showing up escalate violence or not. The truth of the matter is there shouldn't have been let me tell you why. The truth of the matter is that they shouldn't have been allowed. The truth of the matter is they shouldn't have been allowed to commit violence with impunity against certain people. And inevitably, if you allow that to happen, other people will rise up and say, we're going to stop this. And yes, that might escalate violence, but the violence could have been stopped. What you're really saying is this would be like, I could imagine you in the Jim Crow South. If these black people would stop coming together to defend themselves, there'd be less violence. If they just let the racist white people talking about there would be less violence, right?
I have to respond to that motherfucker.
Can we
Holy
talk
shit.
about what could be?
Please leave my mom out of it.
Oh boy!
I actually want to hit Rob with this just real quick. I'm really curious.
It's got to be super quick. We got to move things along.
Yeah, I
very,
get to
very
respond
quickly.
to that. Holy
Like
shit.
2 seconds.
I agree. So we're talking about what could have been and what we should have done, right? And you're directing it, Rob, directly at left wing events and ignoring right wing events and whatever, right?
I just gave examples of
in the future though, would you say that it would be dangerous to have both Proud Boy and Black Lives Matter rallies happening throughout the country causing violence? Would it make sense for everyone to just stop? Would you want this to happen at all?
Look, it's a multifaceted thing. I'll answer as quickly as possible. Yes, what I want to see is the police do their job because we have the legal right to form militias. We have the legal right to arm ourselves and to protect ourselves. That's true. And we always should have that for reasons we've outlined already in this debate. But the incentive for more people to do it is being driven up because we see political pressure from one side at this point in time. It could have been a different side at a different point in time and in the future that is saying violence in our name is okay. We'll have the police stand down. We saw de Blasio have the police stand down. We saw in Atlanta, Philadelphia, Orlando, Portland. We've seen it all over the place. This provides the incentive. That's why so many people think I need to go join the militia because I watched my town burn down and my local police did nothing. And they said that it was violent. Okay, and I saw fires and they said mostly peaceful.
Hold on. I saw
Stupid.
I did not see police.
If we go one step further, though, and say that the right is justified in arming themselves because leftist government officials took the police back, and then the right wing starts acting in kind and starting to do things that are inherently violent against the left, then you realize that the left will do the same thing in kind, right? Like, we either have a cycle of violence or we prevent the cycle of violence.
And just to clarify, right now, the left is not doing that.
Okay, go ahead.
At the same rate that the right is.
That's not true.
Are you good?
We see
it is.
Dollars of damage done by violent lefties that you and not just you, because clearly Doopy
we got it. No. We got to move
Democratic politicians.
Pan's been waiting. Pan, counterpoints and Fanatic, quick.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that, first of all, Doobie, I think you're a bit too optimistic. What you're saying is, hey, if government is good, we won't have to overthrow it and we won't have to, do anything about it. Well, the problem is that we've seen in the past, they do fail at times. And so we need something to do when the government fails. We can't just live in like this utopia where, yeah, the government, as long as the government's good, you're right, none of this is going to be necessary for us to do. But as we've seen, there are times where the government fails, like in Kenosha, and they don't stop the rioting and the violence like they, maybe they should have. And that results in people needing to defend their property. Now, you saying that if you just get rid of like the Second Amendment and stuff like you want to, well, that's not going to fix how crappy government is sometimes. It's only going to make it so in these sort of situations that, they won't be able to defend themselves. You said that it was justified for them to go out and protect their property and stuff after all this violence started to occur. But if, they wouldn't be able to do that. Like, they wouldn't have that power if, they didn't have the Second Amendment. So I don't understand. I feel like you're just too naively trusting the government here to do the right thing. Which
this is
we all
a
know
false
they won't
narrative,
do.
by the way. There were already militias in Kenosha before the violence started. So
Maybe.
just throwing it out there.
It doesn't have to be about Kenosha.
Really quickly. So yeah, the government fails sometimes, right? But if the government fails in a society where there are millions of guns floating around in the public, right, among the citizens, right? When the government fails, these conflicts, like you had in Kenosha, are going to be much more violent, right? Because now you have people with AR-15s, you have people with unregistered firearms in their pocket, right? So this seems like again. So the solution here, right, as we can see from Europe, when you take these toys away from people, less people die, right? Yeah, they can stab each other, but it's far less likely you're going to kill someone with a knife than you are with a gun, right? So ironically, it seems like the solution to this issue is more government authority, more of the government asserting its a monopoly on violence domestically, right? To totally shut down riots. Protesters who stay up past curfew, militia members running around in the forest, fantasizing and jerking off to watching The Patriot and shit. Right? It seems like the correct response to get rid of all this shit is more tyranny, quote unquote. And I don't think any of you guys have made any arguments to indicate that that's not the case.
Okay, let's go. Let's go to counterpoints and then Fanatic.
Honestly, I can do it in closing if Fanatic wants to go.
Okay. Oh, we're not gonna do closing. You know that.
Oh, then I want it. Okay, so Doobie, you are the fucking like I get it. I don't know how much of your personality is memes, how much of it is real. You're the fucking reason why this shit exists in the first place. And on top of that, your insistence that like a society that was armed, coordinated, well-trained, self-sufficient, and all that kind of stuff, that it would collapse harder than a bunch of people who were completely reliant on the government for their security and their social well-being is fucking insane. Like, basically, when you see a governmental failure and collapse where people don't know what to do, then who ends up ruling the anarchy are only the people who know how to use violence. And it's a completely one-sided affair in which, whereas within societies that actually have the ability, like, I don't know, built up social networks and built up security infrastructure and built up community structures, those are the places that are going to come together on the local level and actually survive political catastrophe. So I think your diagnosis, assessment, prognosis, I think it's fucking ass cancer. And then on top of that, I think that like all it takes is like cracking open a history book and I could come up with like example after example after example after example to like 3,000 years before Christ of why you're absolutely fucking wrong. But I'll leave it there. That's fine.
All right,
I think it's really insane to me that Rob Noerr, I don't know how you're doing this. Like the whole time you keep making all of these things where you want to try to understand like why, or you look at like the Proud Boys as a response, but you refuse to look at like BLM as a response, like to something, to an actual problem that occurred within the country, that is currently occurring within this country. I think also like it's really, really telling that like you for this entire time are trying to equate BLM and Antifa, and those teams are entirely different organizations. I mean, there are God knows how many different examples, like video evidence of people, like while the BLM, or not even BLM, but BLM the movement, not the organization, while there were all of these people that were like protesting, and then white Antifa people were showing up and breaking windows and doing all sorts of damage to all sorts of places, and BLM and all the black people there were literally begging them to stop, right? Saying, we're going to get blamed for this. That happened at the Wendy. I don't have to name all the different places. This was a very, very common thing. So then like, it's really crazy to me that you're almost willing to dismiss all that and pretend as if like, no, it's all BLM. I think that's absurd. And then finally, what's it called? Nefarious. Like it's, I get you're saying like, you're a European cuck, right? And so it's really insane to me that like you would be so opinionated on this subject when you don't like you probably aren't familiar with our history. Like when you start making stupid statements like, oh, Americans have a tendency to try to do things themselves. And well, specifically when it comes to like Black Americans, which I guess this is where a lot of this the protests and things were about. The reason why we've done that is because we've been like neglected by our government on God knows how many different times. It's specifically when we look at like Katrina, how long did it take them before they were able to get food to like the people in Katrina, and how disastrous was their aid there? Yet when you have that like natural disaster, and I think it was at Fukushima, right, where that like the nuclear plant, yes, right. When that thing happened, we saw United States able to mobilize insanely fast. They got there within like 2 days. They were able to get all the way across the seas to freaking Japan faster than we could get aid to freaking Katrina. So these kinds of things are why you would see Black Americans recognizing that we are going to have to be self-reliant, because very often the government has failed us. Both the Republican Party and the Democrat Party have done so. The people that we've elected and called Black presidents, like Bill Clinton, like draft God knows some of the worst legislation for Black people in the history of our country. Even people like Barack Obama didn't do anything specifically for Black people. So then it's like when you start really going through it, it makes sense that we'd be really self-reliant. We've been asking for reform in the form of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, and we see Republicans are completely unable to move. And the way you say our checks and balances are working great, so it seems like the Democrats can't get anything passed. So we've had no legislation, despite God knows some of the most pervasive protests in the history of the country, and still we were unable to move anything. So it makes all the sense in the world why we've become significantly more self-reliant. And when we already see all this ridiculous bias within policing, it would make sense that we would probably not be saying, hey, policemen, we're expecting you to actually fix out all of this, and we'll be reliant on you to actually give us the aid and things that we need. It's freaking retarded.